Not many novels have their own title song. This is a song associated with my book, The Unbroken. If you'd like to hear it again, it's on my website and also on YouTube. It's great to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out on this wintry January afternoon. But at least we have this beautiful, inspiring place to meet together. And you'll be glad to know that this is not going to be an academic or philosophical talk. We can all do without another one of those. I want to focus on some things that are important for every one of us in our everyday life. And life itself, for all its challenges, and there are many, is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Every day I think to myself, although it's not quite perfect, I actually love this body that I have, this vehicle for taking me around in the world. I hope you feel the same way about yours, because think about it. 37 trillion cells within our bodies. Each one knows its job, and they talk to each other at 225 miles an hour. 90% of them are renewed every year. And then we've got all those strange squashy organs packed up inside, each with their own special job of working in harmony, more or less. And it's all wrapped up together in this neat skin that renews itself every 2 months. It's quite extraordinary. And then there's the supercomputer of the brain, with its 86 billion neurons. Somebody's actually counted them, by the way. And they're charging around faster than a Formula One car. And none of this happens in isolation. We depend for our lives, of course, on the outside, beautiful natural world. The trees breathe out the oxygen that we need to breathe in. The plants provide the food that we need to eat. They in turn are pollinated by birds and insects. Human life could not exist if bees did not exist. wonderful. But I've got some bad news. Sooner or later, all of this is going to pass away. Every tree, every butterfly, every human being must come to an end. This extraordinary vehicle, like any other vehicle, is going to break down and wear out. When this is over, and the dark night flies in the face of our dreams, when nothing we know is the way that it seems now, will that be the end? Will we still know our lovers and friends? Will we be the same? As it happens, I've got some good news about that. Because the one thing I haven't mentioned about this extraordinary life that we have is our consciousness. It's the most wonderful gift. While our brains are organizing our thoughts and presenting us with interesting dreams, we can be conscious of our own thoughts and conscious of our own dreams. And there is very good reason to believe that that consciousness does not wear out or break down. Medical science has proved many times over that consciousness is not associated with the brain. Many studies have shown that patients with the most severe brain injuries still have full functioning consciousness. Neuroscientists have started to talk about a mental field that we have that exists beyond the physical body. And then we've got the thousands upon thousands of accounts by honest people with nothing to gain about their out-of-body experiences, OBE. What happens here typically, and it can happen during, say, a medical emergency or even during meditation, sometimes spontaneously. A person finds themselves somehow in space looking down upon their resting physical body, but fully aware of who they are and where they are. And they find that they can travel, not just outside the room, but sometimes huge distances to other environments, other situations, and then come back safely to their body, remembering everything that they've experienced. It's quite wonderful. But even if you've never had an OBE, I'm sure that there's nobody in this room who has not experienced at least one paranormal event, something that science says should be impossible. Telepathy, knowing what someone else is thinking. Remote viewing, somehow knowing what's happening somewhere else. Premonition, precognition, knowing what's going to happen. Synchronicity is another example. Or even spiritual healing, sometimes done remotely. All of these things should be impossible, but we all know that they happen. And they're all evidence that we're not just physical beings. It was Joseph Rhine, I'm sure many of you know, at Duke University in North Carolina, who began what we now know as the science of parapsychology. It was he who termed extrasensory perception for us, ESP. He was the first to use that phrase. And he was mainly studying telepathy. He found subjects who could score success in telepathy trials with odds of millions upon millions to one against chance. It shouldn't happen, but it does. These sort of experiments have been replicated many times since then by many other laboratories, sometimes even using Faraday cages, where the subject is enclosed in a cage that blocks electromagnetic energy. Sometimes these subjects have been thousands of miles apart. Telepathy defies time and space. No explanation yet. The American government and the Soviet government, as I'm sure you know, certainly took it very seriously and set up their own programs to investigate telepathy and remote viewing, for military purposes, of course. Shouldn't happen, but it does. When I was young, I did a telepathy experiment myself with my first wife, who was, as it happens, Russian. It wasn't a laboratory experiment, of course, but we did our best to make it accurate. I was using Zener cards, you know, the 5 cards with different symbols on them, transmitting randomly. She scored 72 correct guesses out of 80. I'm a mathematician. The odds of that are 1.5 million to 1 against chance. I've always been interested in parapsychology. In fact, I was quite an odd child, I suppose. I never minded being sent to bed because the nights were full of the most exciting and interesting adventures. And then I began to realize that some of the things I dreamed actually happened in the real world a little while later. They weren't necessarily dramatic things. It may be that I would be with a group of people, I would know exactly what each person was going to say and what the outcome of the situation would be. So I taught myself, and I'm talking about the age of 7 or 8, to remember my dreams, record them, so that I could prove precognition is real. My first book, Spirit Revelations, has hundreds of examples of proven precognition. Let me give you an example. I apologize to 1 or 2 of you who have heard this story before, but it's a good one. When I was a young teacher, the school where I worked was selling off 2 minibuses, writing them off against tax. And I had an idea to buy one of them and turn it into a camper van for holidays. Now, I knew both the buses, I'd driven both of them frequently, and I knew that the older bus was more reliable and in better condition. So I went to the finance director, made an offer. I think it was £100. He agreed and we shook hands. That's how business used to be done a long time ago. And I was quite excited about the whole thing. I went home already planning how I was going to convert the bus. But that night, that same night, I had the following dream. I was driving home in my car from a holiday, and I came to a crossroads, and in the middle of the road was a man selling 2 horses, a mare and a foal. And I thought to myself, I'd quite like to buy a horse. I parked the car and put the hazard lights on, went to talk to the man, and I offered him £450 for the mare, the older horse. Remember that number. But then I looked over my shoulder and I saw the police towing my car away. So I ran after them without making the deal. And then I woke up. Well, you don't need a degree in dream interpretation to see what was happening here. The dream clearly related to holidays. It was very clearly a warning. Crossroads, hazard lights, horse trading is a common symbol for phrase for unethical behaviour. And incidentally, contrary to popular belief, in my experience, the police in our dreams are always helpful. They're always acting on our best interests. And they stopped me from making the deal. I was quite worried then, so surely nothing would go wrong. I knew this finance director, I thought we were friends. 7 weeks later, he put up a notice saying that the 2 minibuses were going to be sold by secret auction. I was angry, quite upset. I went to see him, and he flatly denied ever having talked to me about it, let alone having made an offer. So the auction duly took place. I refused to take part in it. It was unethical. The order bus was duly sold for £450. That night, my mind had time travelled. Shouldn't be possible, should it? But look, there's nothing unusual about me. Yes, maybe I pay more attention to dreams and synchronicity than most people. But each one of you has exactly the same kind of mind that I have. Your mind can reach into alternative states and travel in alternative worlds. It is possible. And there's another phenomenon that has gained a lot of attention recently, and I'm sure many of you have heard about, the near-death experience. What happens here, typically in a medical emergency such as a cardiac arrest, a patient finds himself having an out-of-body experience. They see themselves down below, perhaps on an operating theatre table, and then they see a bright white light, and they travel along a tunnel, and it emerges into a beautiful landscape. Natural beauty, flowers and trees, and they're awaiting relatives or maybe even angels to welcome them. But inevitably there is a barrier of some sort, a gate that they can't cross, and they're told it's not yet your time. So they return to their body, wake up fully conscious, and tell the story. It's extraordinary, and there are no doubt some wonderful personal individual accounts like this. But if we look at the metadata, gather together the hundreds of examples, and there have been metadata studies, the truth of the matter is not quite what the spiritual teachers would like us to believe. It turns out that the bright light in the tunnel are only seen by about 1 in 6 survivors. The beautiful landscape, less than 1 in 10. In fact, about 25% of survivors say they had quite a disturbing experience. And some of them go on to develop PTSD or depression. It's not what you would expect from a visit to heaven. But there are 2 other important issues that I have with the NDE. The first is that the accounts are very often heavily influenced by the survivors' previous religious or cultural beliefs. In other words, they saw what they expected or had been taught to see. Surely, if this is a universal human experience, there should be more agreement. The second and rather obvious problem with the NDE is that none of these people actually died. They all survived. They did not go to an afterlife. On the other hand, what we have is yet more powerful evidence that our consciousness can separate quite easily from our physical bodies and does not depend upon the brain, because in most of these cases there was no brain activity. The people were under cardiac arrest undergoing brain surgery. It's not easy to talk about dying. Most people don't want to talk about it, don't even want to think about it. We fear the unknown. And of course, it's a sad event. It's the end of a lifetime's experience, and it's particularly sad for the loved ones who are left behind. But if we knew a little bit more about what actually happens, what the experience really feels like, and what happens afterwards, surely there would be more comfort in that and take away some of the fear. Nurses in intensive care units, and especially in hospices, frequently go on record to say that the end of life for most people is extremely painless and peaceful. We have also the anecdotal accounts of spiritualist mediums, who sometimes seem to be able to pass on very evidential messages from those who have passed away. But very few of these describe what it's actually like. It's usually along the lines of, I went to sleep and I woke up and my relatives were waiting for me. Well, that's not very helpful. Here's an alternative account. For all our difficulties and differences, and there were many, I had a very close emotional and psychic bond with my mother. She lived to a good age. I knew through precognitive dreams exactly when she was going to die, well before the first of her 2 strokes. So I was able to be with her at the end, in the hospital, sitting by the bed, holding her hand and talking to her. It's very peaceful. And 3 nights later, I was rewarded with the most extraordinary, powerful, vivid, lucid dream, in which she came to me, happy, smiling, wanting to reassure me that she was fine, and she wanted to show me what the experience of dying had been like. And I felt it too, because our minds were so closely linked in that moment. Before, thankfully, waking up and remembering every detail. And I've used that account to open my book. The Unbroken is a love story. And it's an adventure story across the strange worlds of the mind. And it begins with our heroine, Eva, who appears to be leaving this world, and she's telling us what it was like. In the beginning, there was nothing. It's the strangest thing imaginable, being aware of nothing. There was no ground, no surrounding, nothing above, beside, or below. Even I was not there, though I was aware of nothing. You may experience this yourself one day, but I can tell you there will be no fear and no pain. I can say it was beautiful. Nothing has real beauty. Very gradually, I moved from nothing into something. As I became slowly accustomed to the place, a kind of outline of my body emerged. And there were numerous thin filaments like strands of a spider's web, streaming out from my body, sparkling along their length. And then some of them began to detach themselves and float away. Where have they gone? I felt myself asking. And with that, my first thought in this new world. My surroundings were created. The darkness began to lift, and the silence gave way to the murmuring of a gentle breeze. Whatever I was becoming began to move, and so did the shadows around me. Some of them faded away, others floated up to me before disappearing, and there was no threat, no fear. Far ahead there must have been a light. The mist was beginning to glow pure white, becoming more and more like the softest snow, moist, colder, until it billowed into cumulus, and I wanted that light. I had to reach it. But now I was exhausted by everything, by nothing, by not being and then becoming, by the effort of thought. So I gave up and allowed myself to fall into the cloud. That moment was beautiful beyond description, like settling back into the softest imaginable mattress at the end of a hard day, and continuing to fall, to fall, and to fall. When this is over, will we finally see why it had to be? Will our spirits accept its necessity? In the final release, will we be the same? Well, maybe not quite, but there's nothing to be afraid of. Thank you.
The way you describe the an afterlife, it's kind of inspiring. It's certainly got my imagination completely. I'm reading it, for the second time. Is it a rebirth that you're describing, or is it just another consciousness you move into? It's almost described like a physical rebirth, the way I read it.
It is a rebirth, but you see, I've devoted my whole life, I've had an academic career, engineering, science, philosophy, mathematics, but alongside that, I've devoted my whole life to studying consciousness and the paranormal. And you know what? I'm very familiar with the common beliefs that so many people in the spiritual community have about the end of life and the afterlife. And I'm sorry if this upsets anybody, but I think a lot of it is complete nonsense. It doesn't make sense. As I've tried to show in that extract, it's not just a story, it's a rational account of what our minds would surely expect. First of all, we don't know where we are. We've left the physical world. We're still attached, although we're gradually detaching from it. Our minds are struggling to make sense of this new reality. And yes, there will be a light, because we've left behind the world of contrast. And we're drawn inexorably towards that light, towards a new world, a rebirth, as you put it. We don't just suddenly wake up and everything is fine and there's our relatives. And if we go on a little bit further in the book, we see that Eva, when she regains her consciousness, is not at all in a nice, happy, peaceful place with waiting relatives. She's completely on her own, on a strange but beautiful island. And her mind has now got to try to make sense of it all. And that's because she didn't have any preconceptions. She was not religious. She had not been brought up. She'd been brought up under communist rule in Czechoslovakia, as it happens, backstory. She didn't have any preconceptions about what to expect. So she has to make sense of it for herself. And so there are a few chapters where she is struggling to understand her environment and how it keeps mystifyingly changing, and she explores the island until gradually she meets other beings to guide her, not all of whom are human. Anyway, I'm not going to give too much away.
That's good.
What I've tried to show is that many of our common assumptions are rather lazy. If we think about what consciousness really is, what it means, how our minds actually work, then there's a different story to be told. On the other hand, as I say, there is considerable evidence that we are not just physical beings.
That's good. Thank you.
Does it take you a long time to write?
I'll come to you in a sec. I thought there is a prequel, by the way, to this book, if anyone is interested, which is not so much a spiritual book. It tells the story of how the two main characters, Eva and Roy, originally met, and what led up to that first page. That's called Broken Sea. Hopefully there are 1 or 2 copies here, but you'll find it on my website anyway. And that was published in 2018, 50th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. I mentioned that Eva used to be Czech. And I thought that was it. But Eva and Roy kept somehow whispering in my ear that the story's not over yet. There's more to tell. People might like to know what happened to these characters after the rather dramatic ending of that previous book. So I let it swirl around in my mind, because after all, it's a book about the mind, for 2 years. And then my dad turned up in another lucid dream and told me to get on with it, for heaven's sake. So I started writing, and it was all there. My mind had sorted it all out, and I wrote it in 3 months. Gentleman behind.
What do you personally think then the near-death experiences are? What's your personal view? If people have different ones, like so a Muslim will see Allah, a Christian Jesus, or a Hindu God. What's your personal think?
Well, it's a big theme of the book, in fact, that people see what they want to see. And we're all familiar with that in this everyday world here, aren't we?
So what do you think personally happens when people do actually die? Like, do you think they go on to the next world or reincarnate?
I can't give an opinion about reincarnation, although I think it's very possible. I think my belief that I've tried to express through the book is that there are many, many different worlds. Many worlds of the mind that we can move between. And so there certainly is a world of the afterlife, but there are other worlds too. And we don't necessarily need to return to this one.
Like there could be parallel worlds, right?
Exactly so.
Thank you very much.
Parallel worlds. That is a subject, isn't it? How are we doing? Any more questions? Yeah, hello.
Have you any thoughts on the soul trap and the false light? When people say don't go to the light, it's a trap, that you'll be instantly recycled back to this world with the mind wipe, which is what happens as our minds are wiped.
Is there any evidence?
Well, there is evidence that most people cannot remember their previous lives.
Well, most people don't seek to remember their past lives or don't believe in reincarnation. Some of you know that I also own an independent publishing company called Local Legend. And one of our prize-winning books, every 2 years we have a spiritual writing competition nationally. A couple of years ago, the winner was a lady who is a professional past life regression therapist, who tells the most extraordinary stories of people's past lives that have been recounted in her practice. She will say herself, because she takes the subject very seriously, and she gives a great overview of the research as well, that it doesn't really matter whether we believe it or not. What matters is whether these people were healed of their phobias or other difficulties, the reason why they came to her. Now, I'm going to say something very controversial, because I published the book. I think most of the stories are nonsense. I think they're invented by the mind as a way of explaining this world difficulties. Which is not to say that the whole thing is worthless, because these people did in fact receive therapy and did in fact recover from some of their difficulties. And there are other accounts that are quite mind-blowing, and I can't explain those away at all. We don't know. I've tried to give in this talk and through the book as well, I've tried to give an idea of how our minds actually work and what seems a rational way of understanding what happens when the physical body lets go. And I'm sorry, I have little time for theories without evidence. I'm sorry, that seems rude. I don't mean to be rude in any way. What I'm trying to say, clumsily, is that we need to use our intelligence when we're analysing many of these phenomena and the experiences that people talk about. Some people have an agenda. Many people are just perfectly honest, with nothing to gain. But it's the same in everyday life. When somebody interacts with us with some kind of strange story or problem, we have to use our intelligence in trying to understand the truth of the matter. And sometimes we can't understand. I can't answer the question. I don't know. Hello.
Do you believe that, say if you actually have the sensation of already being reincarnated and gone through that several times, but you feel like your soul needs to do more work, like in a different country, or maybe even if it's more, I'm not really going out here with theory, like somewhere in outer space or something. What do you do if you notice how many times your soul's been called back, and the amount of people that say your purpose is here, but yet you feel like most of who you are is being called elsewhere?
That's a very difficult question. No doubt that there is, maybe contrary to the impression I might have just given to the gentleman, there is a great deal of evidence to support reincarnation and past lives. There is perhaps not quite as much evidence as most people think when we look at the actual academic studies, but some of the evidence is extraordinary. And many of us will have, at some point in our lives, an instinct that we've been here before, or this is something that we really need to do. This is a purpose that we have in our lives. I mean, just as a kind of trivial example of what I think you're saying, is when I was a very young man, I was first of all working in engineering, which didn't suit me very well. I knew I needed to travel because I lived in a very parochial, middle-class English environment. And I knew, without doubt, that I had to go to Russia. I had to go to Eastern Europe. And by the way, this was in the middle of the Cold War. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. But everything within me was telling me that I had to get out of here and go to Russia and experience Eastern Europe, which is what I did, and that's how I ended up with a Russian wife. Now, that's not quite the same thing as you're saying, but I think it's very likely that each of us can have those sort of impulses that we need to be somewhere else. When it comes to should we be on a different planet, or should we be a different species that some people talk about in their accounts, perhaps, I have my doubts, because then why are we here?
I think astrology for that.
I think my personal belief is that we are all here for a purpose. We all have particular purposes. Some of them are great and some of them are fairly ordinary, but they're nonetheless important for that. And I think it behoves each one of us to live our lives as meaningfully as possible and to search our minds for that purpose, that special thing that we should be doing here. Yes, we do have a purpose, and it's here. So let's get on with that.
For Nigel,
Yeah.